so today I'm going to show you how to use a binding attachment for a cover stitch machine. The first thing you want to do is prepare your fabric with whatever edge you want to bind and leave it open so that you can start and finish without having to do that in a complete circle. So here's a neckline for a tank top that I'm making. You're also going to want to cut your knit binding because it's a knit tank top. You can also do this with a woven binding, but I'm doing this with a knit binding. And so I've cut this about 1 1/3 inches. And then this is the binding foot attachment, which we will be putting on the machine. So let's take a closer look at how this fits on your cover stitch machine. Okay, so you need these 2 little screws that came with your machine, and you need the binding attachment foot. You also need to make sure you have the clear foot on your cover stitch so that you can see where things are underneath the foot. And I like to just kind of put this on, not very tightly, but so I can begin sewing and see where everything lines up. You will want to adjust this right and left once you see where your stitches are falling onto the binding, and we will slide it left or right so we make sure that stitch placement is correct. From there, we will begin with our knit binding facing the wrong side towards us. So right side's towards the back of the machine, the wrong side facing us, and we just begin feeding this through the binding foot. And I kind of like to have a pin and tweezers handy to help me. Okay, so we continue feeding this through and also making sure that this guide over here keeps the rest of it flat. Once we place it in this second part of the attachment, it will begin to curve in those ends of the fabric and create that binding that we want. So we can use this little hole in the center if you can get your tweezers in there. If not, you can also use a pin. It's just kind of a get it started however you can. And then once you get going, you might think, oh, it's a mess right now. But once we get going, it really does straighten itself out and stay much nicer. So this is just kind of keeping it prepared. And you'll want to make sure your fabric isn't any wider than this guide right here. And then as I'm sewing, I do like to use another hand to make sure that the binding is staying flat. If it does get wrinkled going in, you won't see the nice binding coming back out the other side. So then we will just begin to sew the binding by pulling it under this clear foot. And I still haven't tightened this down, so I will need to do that. But I do want to just kind of check my needle placement. And check the binding. Okay, so I definitely need to move this over a little bit farther to the left. And I'm going to tighten it down a little bit more. So right now it looks like 1 stitch is hitting on the binding and 1 stitch would be hitting on the tank fabric, which is fine. You kind of have that dual stitch where 1 is on the binding and 1 is on. So I have my 2 outer needles threaded, so there's no thread in the center needle. So once you are comfortable with the placement of the binding, you can tighten down the screws to make sure it doesn't move, and then again use your tweezers to feed one end of the binding in between the folded edges of the fabric. And once we start sewing, then the machine will pull the tank fabric as well as the binding fabric through and provide just the right amount of tension on this. So we don't have to worry about stretching or the tension adjustment for the binding. Okay, so for the point of demonstration purposes, I have put the thread in the 2 right needles, and I'm going to show you putting this green binding on one of the arm openings. A little bit different needle position. I like to kind of pull the back end of the binding as it gets started, just to make sure that it is threading through correctly. And again, make sure you're watching all the sides. So now we have 2 needles, the 2 right needles, and they are both stitching through the binding as it's going on. The far left needle does not have thread in it. So I'm keeping this edge along there, and if it sometimes seems like it's getting a little bit stuck, that's when you just kind of grab the back of the binding and help it through over the shoulder seam. That's a spot that sometimes that's going to get a little bit stuck and might need a little bit of help coming through. Okay, and thread it or stitch it all the way off. Use your scissors to cut. And then now you can see this binding, which I actually probably like a little bit better, has the 2 stitches right on top of the binding, and then the back has the cover stitch looper. So there's another alternative for stitching on the binding.